right, good morning, everyone. Good to see you here today. Let's start off the Sunday School Hour by taking our hymnals. We'll stand and turn to hymn 621 to start off the service. 621, standing as you sing, Who is on the Lord's Side? Who is on the Lord's side? Who will serve the King? Who will be his helpers, other lives to bring? Who will leave the world's side? Who will face the foe? Who is on the Lord's side? Who for him will go? By thy call of mercy, by thy grace divine, we are on the Lord's side. Savior, we are thine. Not for weight of glory, not for crown or palm. Enter we the army, raise a warrior song. But for love that claimeth lives for whom he died, they who Jesus nameth must be on his side. By thy love constraining, by thy grace divine, we are on the Lord's side. Savior, we are thine. Jesus, thou hast bought us not with gold or gem, but with thine own lifeblood for thy diadem. With thy blessing filling each who comes to thee, thou hast made us willing, thou hast made us free. By thy grand redemption, by thy grace divine, we are on the Lord's side. Savior, we are thine. Fierce may be the conflict, strong may be the foe, but the King's own army none can overthrow. Round his standard ranging, victory is secure, for his truth unchanging makes the triumph sure. Joyfully enlisting by thy grace divine, we are on the Lord's side. Savior, we are thine. Good sing this morning. Mr. Caleb, would you lead us in prayer for the Sunday School offering?
Dear God, I thank you for the day you've given to us. I pray that you would just bless now the offering, Lord. We thank you for the day that we will celebrate today and tomorrow, Lord. We thank you for our country, for those that have given their lives for it, Lord. Pray that you would just bless us now as we go to Sunday school in your name.
Amen. You may be seated. All right, good morning, everyone. How many of you were up because fireworks kept you up? No? Michael? That's because you were excited, not because they were keeping you awake because of the noise. Yeah. That I believe. That I believe. There's nothing once I fall asleep that's going to keep me awake. fireworks could be going off in my room and they wouldn't be keeping me awake. All right. Hope you're excited for church today. I'm excited to see what all happens today. We got a lot of fun stuff going on. Of course, fireworks at the end tonight. Looking forward to that. And I'm looking forward to the talent show. I am looking forward to seeing. Tim, you signed up. I have no hidden talents. All my talents are out there for everybody to see, and they're not that good. Everything's there. There's nothing I want to display, believe me, and nothing nobody wants to come and see. So, no hidden talents here. I'm interested to see what yours is. So, interested, scared. Yes. I won't be amazed, or I will be amazed. Okay. Will I be frightened by the time I'm done? That's the other question. All right, Amos chapter number 2 is where we're at. There's Amos chapter number 2. Of course, we're getting ready for Independence Day, so I'll have a quiz we can do real quickly. This is U.S. presidents. U.S. presidents. Normally I do a Bible quiz, but I thought this would be fun because it's July 3rd. Of course, today would be the last day of 1863, Battle of Gettysburg, thank you. I was Friday night with the guys in the warehouse. We were up eating the pizza, and half of them, no, not quite half, but a bunch of them were right out of high school or young 20s, and we were talking, and I was getting more and more dismayed at our educational system. I'm like, oh, man. And then one of them said, well, do we really need to know this? And then I started banging my head on a table. Those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. So you guys better start learning some of this stuff. I don't blame them. It came about because some of the guys were talking about World War II, and they were talking about the Germans. And one of the guys was like, well, oh, I remember, because there was a German prison camp. Was it a director or a guard? It was a guard. He's 100 years old, and they just found him in Brazil, I think it was, and he got arrested. And one of the guys was like, "Well, what did he do that was so bad?" And my jaw was like, "Psh." So then we got talking about it, and he's like, "Well, were all Germans bad?" Then I started to cry a little. I'm like, "Yeah, this is really bad. This is really bad." So yes, history is important for us to know. Let's see. This will be fun. These are not multiple choice. Well, I guess it's multiple choice because it's about presidents. So you have some choices. You are narrowed down. It can't be everybody, but yeah. Name the only president to serve for more than 2 terms. FDR, thank you. How long did FDR serve as a president of the United States? Longer than 2 terms. Thank you. 12 years. 12 years. Yeah. What's that? Yeah, he died at the beginning of his 4th term. He was elected 4 times as president. He served 3 complete terms, and at the beginning of his 4th term, he died, and who became president?
That was before they put the max at 2.
Yes, it was because of him that they changed it.
Because now you can serve 10 years. If midway through a presidency, the president dies, and the last 2 years the vice president can serve, and then they can be re-elected.
Correct. Yeah, that would be the only way. If you were vice president, became president, non-elected, but you can only be elected for 2 terms. Who came after Franklin D. Roosevelt? Truman. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to skip that one. That one's too easy. Name the president who was the only one to serve 2 non-consecutive terms so far. Cleveland. Yes, very good. Anybody know what Cleveland had installed in the White House specifically for him? A bathtub, because he was too large to fit into the one that was already there. He was a large man. Which president had the shortest presidency? William Henry Harrison. What's the name of the man who was oldest? He's the oldest in age president. It's not Biden, actually. I didn't say mentally. Anyway. No. It is more recent. Trump. Trump was the oldest when he was elected. You wouldn't think of him he was older than Biden, but you wouldn't know it by looking at him. Okay. Which president was unmarried? Buchanan. I got a teacher in here. I'm going to skip that one because that's too controversial. What is the name of the first president to be born outside the contiguous United States? Obama. Okay, that could get a little issuey. Who was the president who signed a treaty for the purchase of Alaska from Russia? Sure? Nixon. No. Alaska was part of the United States long before Nixon. Not Polk. But you're not far away. Andrew Johnson. Who was the first president to appear on TV? Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the first one. Which president did Walt Whitman write a poem about? "O Captain, My Captain" is written about a president. He's written about Abraham Lincoln. Very good. I didn't know if anybody get that. Second president of the United States? Good. Name of the commission established for the investigation of Kennedy's assassination. The commission established to investigate the Kennedys. The Warren Commission. Very good. Very good. Tallest president of the United States? Abraham Lincoln. Only president to resign from office? Nixon. Civil Rights Act was signed by which president of the United States? No, long before. Grant. Grant signed the Civil Rights Act. Very good. Let's see. Only president who has a master's in business administration. Mm-hmm. GW, George W. Bush is the only one. What are the starting words of the United States Constitution? It's not a president, but we the people. First president to win the Nobel Peace Prize. No. No, it'd be one you wouldn't think would win a peace prize. No. It's not Nixon. What did you say? Yes. Yes, this is Teddy Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt won a Nobel Peace Prize, believe it or not. Name the president who was known as Rough and Ready. No. Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor, yep. President who was the first to use an armored limousine. No. It wasn't Kennedy. This one's hard. Franklin Roosevelt. Anybody know where William McKinley was assassinated? Yes, where was that at? I'm just looking for a city.
Was it Chicago?
No. Not New York City. New York State. What city? No, it wasn't Albany. Nope. Nope. You want to keep going? Give you a hint? Buffalo, New York. Buffalo. Which two presidents were second cousins? That one's tough. No. Were they? No, second cousins is a little bit more specific. They were related, but I don't remember how on that one. Yeah. Zachary Taylor and James Madison were second cousins. So we learned something. Let's see. Some of these aren't Civil War or presidential questions. It's weird. Okay, well that's good. That'll hold us over. That was fun. I like that. You guys did good. I'm impressed. I don't know that I would have gotten all of them. So Amos chapter 2. We've been studying our minor prophets. We are in Amos. We want to get into it this morning in the time that we have left. Amos chapter 2. We are in verse 6. So we're starting now. Amos starts off, and we learned a little bit about him. And he starts off in chapter 1, and we go through some prophecies, some judgments that are going to come upon different nations surrounding Israel. Okay, and we got through all that. And of course, what is our big phrase that we've seen over and over and over and over and over and over again? Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions and for 4. Okay, we've seen that a lot. Then very quickly, Amos does a couple verses of judgments on the southern kingdom. So we're in the divided kingdom. I got to print that off for you guys. I found a really good chart that I like. Charts on the prophets and which kingdom and kings they served under are really tough, and they can be super busy to look at. I found one I liked, and I was like, ooh, and I took a screenshot of it real quick, and I'm going to print it out for you guys to have. That way you can kind of follow along where all these guys, because it can be nigh on impossible without some kind of chart to look at of figuring out when these guys lived and what king under what nation, and it can be so confusing, your head explode trying to figure it out. But I found one, so I'm going to print that out. But remember, Amos is under the divided kingdom, and he's from the southern kingdom of Judah, but most of his message is to the northern kingdom of Israel. So last week, we just kind of touched on or began. So chapter 1, most of it's on nations around. Chapter 2, one nation around it, we get Edom. And then he talks about Judah for a couple verses. And then starting in verse 6, and a lot of the rest of the book, we're going to get the indictment of the northern kingdom of Israel. So let's look at verse number 6 and read through verse 8, and then we'll get into it this morning. Amos chapter 2, starting in verse number 6. Okay, we've heard this a few times. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4. I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they sold the righteousness for silver, and the poor for a pair of shoes, that pant after the dust of the earth on the head of the poor, and turn aside the way of the meek. And a man and his father will go in unto the same maid to profane my holy name. And they lay themselves down upon clothes laid to pledge by every altar. They drink the wine of the condemned in the house of their God. God here in overall sense, and we're going to read more of this, the rest of the chapter here is kind of this section. But he is going to condemn Israel for their injustice and their oppression. I figure this is a very good lesson this morning. We're talking, and we're one day away from Independence Day. Which brings me to a question. On what day was the Declaration of Independence signed? And if any of you say July 4th, I'll be angry. July 2nd. July 2nd. Okay. There was actually kind of a little fight there between some of the members of the Second Constitutional Congress on what day they should celebrate, but they ended up with July 4th. But July 2nd was the day the Declaration of Independence was signed. Anyway, off track. But we're talking about freedom from oppression and injustice in the United States. Freedom, that's what we were fighting for. 1775, 76, 77. Okay, what year did we finally gain our independence? Well, that was a good answer. He said we're still working on it. That was a good answer. Trying to get back what we lost a little bit too. But God is condemning Israel here for their oppression of the poor and the weak. The major theme throughout the book of Amos is Israel's oppression of those less fortunate than themselves in their own country. The injustice that the people had among themselves as a nation. This theme is repeated several times throughout the book of Amos. We see it in chapter 2, verses 6 and 7, which we just read. Chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. Well, we'll get to those portions later, but write them down. Chapter 4, verse 1. Chapter 5, verses 11 and 12, and chapter 8, verses 4 through 6. The idea of freedom or injustice and oppression that the nation was perpetrating on those that couldn't defend themselves, couldn't help themselves. In Israel's sin of oppression and injustice, it was never divorced, or realized it wasn't divorced from their relationship with God. The further they got away from God, the more injustice, the more sin, the more oppression they had upon the people. That goes for any nation, doesn't it? The further we get from God as a nation, the more oppression there will be on people. Okay, that's why right after World War II, or really after World War I, when the communists took control of Russia, they divorced themselves completely from God. And oppression was the rule then for, 60 years. Don't believe in God. Don't want to have anything to do with God, and oppression will come. Israel was oppressive and unjust because she turned away from God and his law. Her first commandment, what is the first commandment to the nation of Israel? Deuteronomy chapter 6. Okay, chapter 6 is Moses exhorting the people to hear God and to keep his commandments. Verse number 4 says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love," we got to turn the page, "the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thy heart. Thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children. Thou shalt teach them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest in the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. And thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thy head, and they shall be as frontlets between thy eyes. And thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house, and on thy gates. And they shall be when the Lord thy God, and it shall be when the Lord thy God shall have brought thee into the land which he sware unto thy fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give thee great and goodly cities, which thou buildest not." And he continues to talk about that. But the first commandment is to love God. It continues to be the first commandment. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy might. We are supposed to love God. And the further they get away from that, the further they get from loving each other. The social gospel, I'm not going to get into some of those things. Yeah, I'm going to skip some of that. Anyway, social gospel is not what we're here for. The social gospel says, well, if we love them, then they'll find God. Love others. Are we supposed to love others? But we're supposed to love God first. And then, as we love God, he will point us to those. And then they will see our love for God. They will come. Okay? Now, they need to hear. Okay? They can't hear without a preacher. But it's not our job to feed the world as a church. It's not our job to end poverty as a church. Okay? It's our job to win souls. Okay? As people get close to God, they'll learn what you need to do to feed yourself. They'll learn what you need to do with your money. The Bible takes care of all those things. It teaches people how to deal with every facet of life. But they need to know God first. Okay? The social gospel isn't going to do that for them. Oppression and injustice, the sins of Israel here that we're going to talk about, are terrible sins, and they're sins against one's neighbor. the heart of God's law when it deals for men with men is what? What is the heart? What does God say in our dealings with other men? Eye for an eye? Sometimes we'd like to think that, right? Be easier that way. But what is the heart of God's law? What does God say with man's dealings with other men? How ought we to act? Stephanie? Love thy neighbor as thyself? Yeah. What about the New Testament? I was going to say something, but I will not. Love your enemy. So, when Christ did the Sermon on the Mount, what was he doing? We talked about this when we studied Matthew. Yeah, he was making it tougher, harder. He says, ye have heard that it hath been said, but I say unto you. Okay? And he made it harder. He made it even tougher than what even the Pharisees were saying. And they were making it tough. But what was the point? The point was, well, you can't obey the law. There's nothing we can do. We can't. It's impossible for us to obey the law. The point was pointing to Christ. Okay? But the heart of God's law is found in Galatians chapter 5, verse number 14. I'll read it for you. For the law is fulfilled in one word, even this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Well, that seems pretty easy. It's interesting, right? Paul says to the Galatians, he's like, here's all the Old Testament. Love your neighbor as yourself. Ha! You don't know my neighbor. I don't know my neighbor. I hear things, but yeah. We used to worry at night because Mr. Miller lives in the house on the corner there in Center Square. And I do know Mr. Miller. He's a nice guy, but he hasn't come out much. And I've seen his wife like once in 16 years of living in that house. I've seen his wife one time that I can remember. But Mr. Miller I see a lot, mowing, cleaning up the yard, whatever. But Melody and I used to joke because our bedroom is on that side of the house. And in the winter, I'm not sure what he's doing, but we hear this. We used to say that Mr. Miller was burying the bodies. We didn't know him that well. Like, somebody pull the curtains down. He's burying the bodies. We don't want to be witnesses. We are to love our neighbors as ourselves. In James chapter 2, verse 8, what is this called? Does anybody know? James 2:8. Let's turn it. I didn't even have it marked. James 2:8. I know what it is. Did somebody say it?
I don't have the exact words.
It's called the royal law in James 2:8. If you fulfill the royal law according to the scriptures, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, ye do well. Okay, it's called the royal law. It's God's royal law is to love your neighbor as yourself. It is because it is the law of the loving King of Kings. It's God's law. He loved us. He gave himself for us. So we ought to love others. We ought to portray Christ's love in our love for others. It's not only our law, but it was also Israel's law. Israel was supposed to follow these same type of, they were supposed to love each other. They were supposed to be brethren. They were supposed to take care of one another. And this whole indictment of Israel, I'm building a case here, like a lawyer, I'm building a case. This whole indictment that Amos is going to give on Israel was that they were doing the complete opposite. They had left following God. Thus, as they got further and further away from God, they got further and further away from loving one another. And that's what we're going to see has happened to the nation of Israel. Instead of loving their neighbors and treating them with in a just and righteous manner, they turned judgment into gall and the fruit of righteousness into hemlock, according to Amos 6:12. We'll get there later. But they turned the love for their neighbor into a poison and a hatred. Can you imagine living next to somebody you hate? That's what they did. So let's look at some of these verses. It says in verse number 6, "For thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4, I will not turn the punishment thereof, because they had sold the righteousness for silver." What does it mean when they sold the righteousness for silver? Yes, sir.
One thing I can think of is just the relationship to how the Christ was sold for
Ooh, I like that.
the parallel.
Yeah, there is a parallel there, and I do like that. I think there's some slight foreshadowing going on here of what's going to happen to Christ later. But what's happening in Israel that Amos is specifically talking about, I did like that. That's a good, I'm going to write that down. Study some of that more. Any other ideas? What are the righteousness? What does it say? He says he sold the righteousness for silver. What is he talking about when he says the righteousness? I like the idea of it's foreshadowing Christ, but it's not Christ because he hadn't come yet. Sam? It's righteous, sorry. The righteous. Okay, what kind of people? Well, we got to examine that a lot, Janet. There's a lot of people I know who think they're right, but they're not righteous. Well, not necessarily just the prophets, but probably some of those as well. The righteous here refers to those who love God and those who are obeying his law. When we obey the law of God, we are being righteous. Okay? What should happen to people who are righteous in Israel? In the nation of Israel, what should have happened to the people who are righteous? What should be their reward for that? They should be loved. They should be elevated, right? People who are doing what's right should be high in society. But what often happens, and happens today still, and this was what has happened. Remember, we're talking about God's people, his nation. Okay, the northern kingdom of Israel, I know it's split, but it's God's people still. Instead of being respected in Israel, and I believe the prophets would be part of this, people who should have been elevated to positions of respect and authority, people who were still following God's law, instead they were targets of persecution. Yes, I relate to him often. Even their children. Yeah. If the children were doing that, what do you think the adults were doing? Maybe not quite so openly, but in their houses. Because how did the children learn to do that? Mary?
It's funny that would be brought up because that's what I was reading in my devotions this morning. And my question is, why their children? Why did God feel the need for them to be killed? I mean, I realize the prophet. I get that. I understand that. But again, their children, is that because it's stopping it, like, before it gets worse?
You could speculate, but whatever God does is right.
Exactly. I understand that. But it just, I was wondering why. I mean, you know,
I think it shows the severity of what they were doing. It's an example for us. You know, they were making fun of the man of God. Was there any respect at all? No. A couple thoughts. Caleb and then Kimberly.
The word used there in that story for children is the same one used for young adults.
Yeah.
It's a wide range of age. So they could have been anywhere from 10 years old to 18 years old. Could have been that whole range even. And so, given their age, they knew what they were doing. They weren't,
It wasn't like Walker was coming and said, "Hey, Baldy."
they weren't 5 and 6-year-olds playing with their
Yeah.
alcohol, lifestyle. Oh, look, here's a funny thing. Or they were still in it.
I no longer fall into the young category in any way, shape, or form. Kimberly. Yeah. Oftentimes we see that story and you think, it was. Yeah. I can't prove it from the scriptures, but I personally believe there probably were teenagers because I have a teenager and I know how they are. Okay. And yeah, if I had a bear whistle, yeah, it helps in your mind if you realize they probably weren't this big. They were probably taller than he was. But anyway, either way, God is right. Let me see. I lost my train of thought. Oh, I was going to give some examples. Examples of people in Israel who were righteous, who were looked down upon. Does anybody have an idea? One of them had a vineyard. Naboth and his vineyard, 2 Kings 4, we see that Naboth refused to sell his vineyard to Ahab because he was honoring the law of God. That's why he didn't want to sell it. It wasn't because he was being stubborn. Okay? It wasn't like the king came to Naboth and he was like, no, it's mine. No, that's not why he was refusing. He was refusing to sell it because he was honoring the law of God. It was his inheritance. Okay? And Ahab pouted. Jezebel stole it and murdered. Okay? So an example of somebody who was righteous, who wasn't honored but destroyed. And there's others in the scriptures that we could talk about. It says in verse number 6 at the end, so they sold the righteous for silver. Okay, they got rid of, they looked down upon those who were doing right. Okay? And it says, this is interesting, the poor for a pair of shoes. The poor for a pair of shoes. What does that have to do? What does that mean?
Is that like when they were bonded as far as having the poor as servants? I don't know, just going out.
I think you're overthinking it a little bit. It literally means they sold the poor for a pair of shoes. How much was a pair of shoes worth? Now, they didn't have Nikes or Air Jordans back then. Can you imagine? David and Goliath, he reached down and he picks up 5 stones. He's like, pump, 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 pump. You gotta pump up. That was the thing. When I was a kid, you had to get the pumps and you had to pump up your shoes so you could jump higher. I don't know. It probably didn't even work. Yes, sir.
It sounds like the relevance of the poor became so insignificant that for a pair of shoes was more important than not taking care of the poor.
It's exactly what it is. Yeah, it's exactly what it is. What did they wear for shoes? Sandals. Okay? I own a pair of flip-flops. They're not worth much, are they? Does anybody have a pair of flip-flops that are worth anything? I forgot there were ladies in the room. Never mind. Forget that. Forget I said that. I paid $7,000 for my flip. No. He almost lost his drink. He's like, "Blah." Can you imagine? I'm sure you didn't pay that much for a pair of flip-flops. But it does literally mean that the poor became so insignificant to people. Their hearts had become so hardened, so sinful. They had gotten so far away from God that when they saw somebody poor, it was worth less. That person was worth less to them than a pair of shoes. That's literally what it means. Deuteronomy 15. Of course, Deuteronomy is all about God's law. Moses giving God's law to the people and all the different ceremonial laws, laws dealing with every situation. Deuteronomy 15, 7 through 11. Okay, this is God's law concerning the poor to the nation of Israel. What his people ought to do. If there be any among you a poor man of one of thy brethren within any of thy gates in thy land which the Lord thy God hath given thee, thou shalt not harden thy heart, nor shut thine hand from thy poor brother. But thou shalt open thine hand wide unto him. Thou shalt surely lend him sufficient for his need, in that which he wanteth. Beware that there be not a thought in thy wicked heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of release is at hand, and thine eye be evil against thy poor brother. Thou givest him naught, and he cry unto the Lord against thee, and it be a sin unto thee. Thou shalt surely give him, and thine heart shall not be grieved when thou givest unto him. Because for this thing the Lord thy God shall bless thee in all thy works, and in all that thou puttest thine hand unto. For the poor shall never cease out of the land. Therefore I command thee, saying, thou shalt open thine hand wide unto thy brother, to thy poor, and to thy needy in thy land. This is God's law to his people concerning the poor. And he says, not only does he have a lot to say about what they should do, but it has to do with what their attitude to the poor should be. Right? It talks about what shouldn't even be in their mind. They shouldn't even be looking for return. That they should be willing to give to the needy. We're always going to have the poor with us. Even Christ says, the poor you'll have with you always. But they should have been willing to give to their brethren. And yet, what they were doing was they sold the poor for a pair of shoes. You can see how God's anger would have been kindled against them because they were going completely against his commandment. Tim.
It's still the same even with us in the New Testament, because the Bible says, when expect nothing in return.
Yeah.
So if you're willing to give something, which you should be. But if you're going to give, no matter what, even if, in that arrangement it says, you say to each other, I will return it, you shouldn't expect it back. But then the person that has it.
Yeah. I had this situation at work not that long ago. I had a guy come up to me and say, hey, I don't have enough gas to get home. My first thought wasn't, stinks to be you. Like, where's my wallet? What do I have? 0 cash. But the idea is to give to that person. And yes, I did. I actually took time to go to the bank, get some cash out, brought it back, got an envelope, gave it to him. I'm not saying that, but am I expecting it back? No. Do I care? No. And I went home to my wife and she said, well, what if you got swindled? Then I got swindled. Okay? It doesn't matter. God says to give. So we give. And a lot of people worry about, well, what happens if they take advantage of you? Then I get taken advantage of. That's fine. I'm a big boy. I can handle it. Bigger than I used to be. Yeah. So we give. And that's what the people of Israel were not doing. Tim, you were going to comment before that?
You brought that up, and then,
Yeah.
I think it was last year, there were 3 of us, came home and got my job site. It was like 100 degrees out. I had to run out for some supplies. So on the way back, it was about a mile from the job site. I stopped and I got the biggest thing of ice cream I could get at an ice cream store. And I brought them back to them. And they were like, oh, thank you. And the one guy refused to take it. And the other one's talking to him and he says, well, what's your issue? He's like, well, then I'll owe you. And I said, you didn't ask for it. It's a gift. Take it.
Yeah.
2 weeks later, he comes up to me and he says, well, here's money for the ice cream. And I was like, I do not want it. I said, it was a gift. I gave it to you freely.
Sure.
Keep it. And I said, by doing this, you're removing the blessing from me that I was to you.
Yeah.
And he didn't understand that.
I told him, I said, listen, I've been in that place too.
Right.
And people gave to me. Praise God. God bless them. I'm going to return the favor now that I'm in a different position. You see how ungodly it was. Their hearts were hard and cruel. There was no kindness, no compassion. We ought to be kind and compassionate. Stephanie. Yes.
And now here again in verse 6, talking about slavery, it must be something that Amos had to deal with a lot there in Israel.
Yeah, and it should not have been that way. There was, in the law, the way the system works, if you went into debt, there was debtors' prisons, there was servitude because of debt. But anybody know how long that could last? The maximum. 7 years. We even kind of read that in Deuteronomy where it says in the year of Jubilee, I have to turn back there, but don't look at it like don't look at it as if this year is coming up and, ooh, I'm going to get them for 7 whole years. There was things set up in the law to release them for that. But what Israel had done is they had taken the practices of all the heathen nations around them and began to get into and they were the ones who were sold into slavery a lot. You imagine a people that was sold into slavery, that were slaves in Egypt at one time as a nation, wouldn't go back to that, but they were starting to get involved in that kind of thing. Absolutely. It's a good point.
I was thinking of the same thing when we were reading that with the 7 years, how it says it. And I think what you were saying, like, oh, he's thinking if I do this, I'll get him for 7 years. But I think the scripture here is saying, that he wouldn't land because the
Yeah.
7th year was coming. He's saying, okay, well, the 7th year is coming. I am not going to have you for that. I can't keep you under my thumb.
Right. It has to do with their attitude.
Right.
Yeah. He's like, don't think of it like, oh, well, I'm not going to get much return out of this because they're not going to be there very long. The year of Jubilee is coming up, and like 2 days later, I'm going to have to let them go. I'm going to have to free them of their debt, because that's what it was. You had to free everybody from their debts. Yeah, you got a lot of stuff. So every 7 years, there was happiness. That's why they called it the year of Jubilee. I'm out of. Oh, man, we didn't get very far. Let me try to get another verse in here, if we can. It says in verse 7 that pant after the dust of the earth on the head of the poor. Okay, this is a metaphor in the scriptures. It's a powerful metaphor that describes their raging covetousness. They were so greedy that it was as if they had lusted after the very dust on the head of the poor, not content with taking their money, not content with just taking their property, but putting them down to the point where they were so impoverished that they were starving. That's the idea here. It verse says that pant after the dust of the earth on the head of the poor. Being so cruel, so nasty that you want to put somebody down so bad, that's so far into poverty that you're willing to the point of even killing. The idea here is like of Naboth and his vineyard, that you would take from somebody and hate them so much that you, to the point of killing them, even to the point of letting somebody starve to death because you were so covetous you would not give somebody a morsel of bread. That shows some real covetousness, doesn't it? Some hatred, some distance from God. And that's what was happening in the nation of Israel. Now you're beginning to see why God pronounces the judgments he's going to pronounce on his people. This was their brother and this was their fellow Israelites. They were supposed to be God's people. They're supposed to love one another. Yet they hated each other so much. That's what they were like. Let me see. I think I have a quote here. This is from Barnes. He says this: covetousness, when it has nothing to feed it, craves for what is absurd or impossible. Okay, and that's what this is. It's talking about the covetousness even to the dust. Why would you want the dust off somebody's head? It's like, I'm so covetous, I want your dandruff. Like, that's absurd, right? But that's basically what it's saying. That's what it's saying. Like, I want you so low, I'm going to rub your face into it. That's what the Bible is describing. It says, covetousness, when it was nothing to feed on, craves for what is absurd or impossible. What was Naboth's vineyard to the king of Israel, who lived in an ivory palace? What was it? Did it mean that much to a man who lived in an ivory palace, a bunch of grapes? No. What is trivial gain to a millionaire? The sarcasm of the prophet here is more piercing because it's so true. Covetousness grows with its gains. It is less satisfied the more that it has to satisfy it. The more you get when you're a covetous person, the more you crave. You have so much that it could satisfy you. I live in a house that has 16 bathrooms, right? Every time I go to the bathroom, I can go into a new one. But I'm not satisfied. I need a bigger house. I have an Olympic-sized swimming pool, but the neighbor is putting in 2. So now I have to have 4. That's what covetousness does to people. And you can see it. By the uselessness of the things it craves, you can see covetousness. What do they need that for? What do you need? You know, you see these people, I have 32 cars in my garage. Well, as far as I know, you can only drive one at a time. I mean, unless you're got a hidden talent that you're going to show us later. Okay? It just becomes to the point of perverse. And that's what he's saying here. Let's finish verse number 7. I'll let you go. It says, turn aside the way of the meek. This refers to the perversion of justice. The perversion of justice that was happening in the land of Israel. And I see people gathering, so we're not even going to get, we didn't get far today. But we got a good lesson in. What has America become? Covetous? Perverse? Do you think God's judgment is going to come? I do. It does. Now, can we turn it back? Yeah. If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven, forgive their sins, and heal their land. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for the time we had to look quickly into your word this morning, get a few verses in Amos chapter 2. We thank you for the lessons that are learned there. I pray now that you'd just dismiss us with your blessing and love and bring us back together again quickly for the morning service. Be with Pastor as he preaches. Lord, to give us safety throughout the day as we enjoy our time together as a church family and the visitors and enjoy celebrating the freedoms that we have in the country that you've given to us. In your name I pray. Amen. All right, you're dismissed. We're out of time. Very much out of time.